Hello, in today's video we will be looking at how to solve the odd one out question type in the 11 plus. It is important to note that for there to be an odd one out, we will need 4 pictures that have something in common that one doesn't. Let's look at question 1. Here we have some shapes with some arrows pointing between them. Let's analyse the shapes to see if we can find an odd one out. In picture A we have 2 squares. Picture B has 2 circles. C has 2 squares, D has 2 circles, and E has 2 squares. Therefore, there is no clear odd one out yet, because there are 3 pictures with squares and 2 pictures with circles. Next, let's look at the arrows to see if there's an odd one out there. In picture A, we have 2 different arrowheads, both pointing to the center of the squares. In picture B, we have 2 identical arrowheads, with one pointing to the center of the circle and one pointing to the edge. In picture C, we have 2 identical arrowheads, with one pointing to the center of the square and one pointing to the edge. In D, we have 2 different arrowheads, with one pointing to the edge of the circle and one pointing to the center of the circle. And finally, in picture E, we have 2 different arrowheads, with one pointing to the center of the square and one pointing to the edge. Therefore, you might have noticed it by now, and that is that the odd one out is A, because it's the only shape where both arrowheads point to the center of the shapes. Let's look at question 2 now. Here we have some stars, with some semicircles, triangles, and arrows. First thing to do is to count up the number of points on the stars. Picture A has 7, picture B also has 7, C also has 7, D has 7, and E has 7. So there is no odd one out there. Next, let's look at the triangles in some of the points. A has 3, B has 2, C has 3, D has 2, and E has 3. So again, no odd one out, because there are three triangles and 2 with 2 triangles. Finally, let's look at the insides of the stars with the semicircles and arrows. First, we have an arrow pointing from the black semicircle to the grey semicircle. Next, we have an arrow pointing from the black semicircle to the grey semicircle again. In C, we have an arrow pointing from the black to the grey. However, in D, we have an arrow pointing from grey to black. Finally, in E, we have an arrow pointing from black to grey. Therefore, the odd one out is D, because it's the only shape where the arrow points from grey to black. Let's look at question 3. Here we have some polygons with some missing parts from them. Let's look at what they would be if they had their parts. A would be a square if we drew straight lines down. B would be a square if we drew straight lines down. C would be a hexagon if we drew a shape like that on both sides. D would also be a hexagon. And finally, E would be a square. So there is no odd one out because there are 3 squares and 2 hexagons. Next, let's look at the shapes we would get if we combine this missing chunk with this missing chunk. So in A, we'd have a regular heptagon. In B, we'd have a square. In C, we'd have a regular pentagon. And in D, we'd have a regular octagon. However, in E, we'd have an irregular heptagon, meaning that E is the odd one out, because it would be the only shape where the missing chunks combine to make an irregular shape. Next, let's look at question 4. Here we have some squares, circles, and triangles combined by straight lines and one wiggly line. Let's look at the number of squares, circles, and triangles in each. Well, in A, B, C, D, and E, we have 1 square each. We have 1 circle each, and we have 1 triangle each. So we know it's not the shapes that we have a problem with. Next, let's look at the number of types of lines. In A, we have 2 straight lines and 1 wriggly line. Same goes for B. C also has 2 straight and 1 wriggly. D has 2 straight and 1 wriggly, and E has a wriggly line and 2 straight lines. Therefore, we don't have an odd one out with the number of lines. Finally, let's look at how the lines and shapes interact. In A, the wriggly line goes between the square and the circle. In B, it is also between the square and the circle. In C, it is also between the square and the circle. However, in D, it's between the square and the triangle. Finally, in E, it's between the circle and the square. So the odd one out is quite clearly D, because it's the only shape where the wriggly line goes from the square to the triangle. Let's look at question 5. At this point, you can pause the video to try one yourself, as we've had some practice already, and then play the video again to see what the answer is. So in A, we have a pentagon, B also has a pentagon, C has a pentagon, D has a pentagon, and E has a pentagon, all regular, so no odd one out yet. Next, let's look at the colour of the dot in the middle. A has grey, B has grey, C has black, D has grey, and E has black. So no odd one out because there are 3 grey and 2 black. Next, let's look at the direction the arrow points in. In A, it's pointing in an anti-clockwise direction, this way. In B, it's pointing in a clockwise direction, this way. C is anti-clockwise, this way. D is anti-clockwise as well, And finally, E is also anti-clockwise. Therefore, the odd one out is B, because it's the only arrow which goes in a clockwise direction. If you got that, well done. And finally, I'll leave you with a little challenge to try yourself. If you think you have the answer, please put it down below in the comment section, and I'll tell you if you're right. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a big old thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe to see more videos like this.